Hey guys, welcome into another episode of 410 Sports Talk. Really excited to talk some more Ravens talk with you guys. I'm James Haskell. As always, this is my co-host Glenn Martin. And as the draft continues to inch closer and closer, even though this draft is going to be a little unique, we still think it's very important to understand how to watch the draft as a Ravens fan. Right? It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the sexy picks and all the news that's swirling around the draft. But there's some specific things that we should keep in mind when it comes to the context around the Ravens and the draft. So we're going to kind of break down some of those things to help you guys know how to grade the draft, whether we're doing good, whether, fulfilling our positions of need, and then also whether or not you can feel good about those picks. So having that context can be really important. So Glenn, let's get right into it and so some points that we consider to be really important when it comes to the Ravens in this year's draft.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing you have to do is identify the areas. I think the first thing we're going to do is identify the areas where the Ravens don't need an upgrade. Identify a couple of positions where, as a Ravens fan, we should all be rooting to get picked before at 28 where the Ravens pick.
And why is that?
Because the more of those players that get picked at those positions that we don't need, the more players at other positions we do will be pushed down to us and give us the opportunity to fill some holes that are more glaring. So let me just get right into a couple of those positions. Number one, first and foremost, is quarterback. The more quarterbacks get taken in that first round, the more players that we would be interested in are going to fall down because, of course, we have Lamar and we do not need a quarterback. So
I'm a quarterback? What?
I know. It is the greatest it's the best position to be in the draft when you don't need a quarterback because, as we all know, if you don't have one, you're not going to be very good. And if you need one, you're probably going to have to spend a very high pick or a lot of picks to get up to that very high pick to get to it. So, so the good thing is we got our guy. We got Lamar. We don't need the one thing that you can't be without if you want to win a Super Bowl, which is a quarterback.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, that same idea applies to a couple other positions, which sound very similar to quarterback, but I'm saying cornerback, not quarterback. Corner. That would be the number 2 position that we want to go early. So because we got Marlon Humphrey, we got Jimmy Smith, we got Tavon Young, we got
Peters.
Marcus Peters. There you go. And so we're deep as far as the secondary in general goes, and especially at corner. So we want those cornerbacks to go early, like Glenn said, to push those other positions of need down in the draft. And then the third one is offensive tackle. Now notice that Glenn and I are specifying that not offensive line, offensive tackle. We have 2 all-pro tackles, if I'm not mistaken. I know, obviously, Ronnie, and then Orlando Brown was at least a Pro Bowler. So yeah, we're pretty much set at our bookends as far as offensive line. So we want those offensive tackles to push up and go early before our pick. So those are the 3 positions that we think would be positions that we want to go early in the draft because they're not a need for us and we'll leave more guys available for the positions that we do need. Now, Glenn, let's turn the page. Why don't you talk about some positions that we want to be on the board, and to identify as positions of need for the Ravens?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just clarify about the offensive tackle. There is a possibility, as most NFL teams, that they will draft a tackle that they have plans to move inside to guard. There's plenty of very good, talented tackles that we'll see play in college that just don't have the skills necessary to translate that to the NFL. So if you see them grab a tackle, just know this, that they are planning to move him inside to either guard or center.
That's what they did with Marshall Yanda.
Exactly. So that's completely possible. But so when we say tackle, we mean guys that are planning on actually sticking at tackle when they move to the NFL, which, of course, is the top guys. All right, so now we're going to identify some positions of need on both offense and defense. Now, these aren't necessarily agreed upon order because obviously me and Jimmy disagree on which need is most important. But I made this particular part of this list, so I put inside linebacker first, okay? And again, no order. But inside linebacker is clearly a glaring need. We have virtually none returning from last year outside of L.J. Fort. And Chris Board, who played, I guess, a good portion in the beginning of the season. And then Atoku, what was it? What was that? Man, he played well in the preseason, and then he ended up getting put on IR. I think it was Atoka.
Iloka or
Iloka, yeah, I think it was that. Yeah,
yeah,
he's a pretty good player though.
yeah.
For a young guy. But then, so inside linebacker is certainly going to be a target for them early and often in the draft. And then Jimmy, I'll let you expand on your number one need.
Yeah, of course. Inside, interior offensive lineman is another one that we want to. That is that we've identified as a top position of need. My opinion, the top position of need. So those two between Glenn and I, we've inside linebacker and then interior offensive lineman are what we've considered to be the top positions of need. So the idea behind that is that one thing to keep in mind is our needs might, as much as we like to consider ourselves GMs, might not line up with Eric DaCosta and his staff's needs in his mind and,
Yep.
The cards on the table that they see and the free agents that they know are out there. But we want to see as many of these guys at these positions available at our pick and our picks throughout the draft. But there are two other ones. What else you got on the board there, Glenn?
Yeah, so we also have edge rusher on defense and wide receiver on offense. And clearly edge with Judon being our only really returning sack artist. Although they did add Calais Campbell and Derek Wolfe, who certainly are going to provide some pass rush. They need some help at outside linebacker. I think Ferguson made some strides last season, but I doubt that anyone's really comfortable with him leading the charge on the opposite side of Judon. And I know they brought back why am I blanking on his name? Jihad Ward, and he played well, but not necessarily great at pass rush. He's good against the run, but not providing a lot of rush from the passer. So I certainly think edge is definitely going to be a target where they're going to be going after. And then wide receiver, they lost Seth Roberts to the Panthers in the free agency, and they honestly, with him, they weren't very good. They were at best mediocre, and really, you take Hollywood Brown out of that, and it's really bad. So, and we know he's one injury away from being out there. So I think wide receiver is going to be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've done so far is we've identified the positions that we don't need, identified the top positions of need, and now what we're going to get to is also positions of need, but positions that need depth. Yeah. Right. So there's two different distinctions here. There's positions that we need guys to come in and contribute right away, like plug and play type roles. And we are probably going to use the top half of our picks and our draft equity to address those positions. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to address other positions because we have a plethora of picks, but there are also some positions that we've established as guys that we need. Once again, we need some depth at. So we have a couple of those positions as well because it's important as you guys watch this draft to keep those positions in mind as well. So a couple of those are, of course, running back. Based on our style in general, it's really important to have depth at running back because Mark is, pushing 31, I think. And then, of course, we have Gus and Justice Hill, but you're always one injury away, just like we saw in the playoffs, of having a thin backfield. So having a stable of backs is important. Same thing that goes for safety. I think Glenn would agree with me. Only that our safeties, we got Chuck Clark just signed an extension, but, Earl is not a spring chicken. And then if he goes down, it's just Chuck back there and a guy that we can plug in. But having a third fiddle, if you will, that can contribute would definitely be important. And I know there's some other positions on there that we consider to have need of depth. What are some other spots you got there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to touch on safety also. We know Deshaun Elliott's back there as well. And a lot of people have high hopes for him, but he's been hurt every year, and you just can't really count on him, unfortunately, even though, like I said, there is high hopes. So, the other position would be tight end. We just saw Hayden Hurst get traded to Atlanta for a second-round pick. But and we love our tight end room with Boyle and Andrews, but you need three tight ends to run this offense. I know that a lot of people are expecting them to move more in the direction of adding outside threats and getting the wide receiver more involved than we saw last season. But this is still a run-first, run-heavy team, and they like using what they got, all three tight ends. Now, Ricard, a lot of people consider him to be kind of akin to the tight ends because of his size and blocking ability. But I think they're going to need some depth at the tight end position. I think that's safe to say, and I think we'll look at them to add a tight end at the back end of the draft. Because it's certainly not a tight end rich draft like last season. So, yeah, I think later in the draft we could expect that. And then interior defensive line. We know that they've added Wolf, they've added Calais, but they also trade away Wormley. They brought back Justin Ellis. But I think what they need there is a guy that's versatile, a guy that can play inside, outside, in our scheme, can do both. And just a guy that's young, can provide some depth, because Calais Campbell is, as you mentioned, Earl being older. Calais is older than him. So, and Derek Wolf has had injury issues. I think he's 30, but he's had injury issues. So, like as you mentioned, one injury away from having a thin position. So I certainly think they could provide or could use some depth in the interior defensive line.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to keep in mind is we've identified positions that are our top need and then positions that we need depth at. We're predicting, at least, I know I am, and I'm sure Glenn is doing the same, that as we mentioned, we separated those two groups. We'll probably use the top half of the pick to go after those guys we need immediately, and then the second half, of our picks to go after those depth positions. But don't be surprised if you see that switch, because at the end of the day, it comes down to how the board breaks down, best player available. If we see a guy at running back that EDC is Eric DeCosta is in love with, and we consider value at number one, at our first round pick or early in second round, he's going to pull the trigger. He's not going to hesitate.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yep, absolutely. And I think we pointed out in previous videos that this is clearly a win now team. This isn't an organization that's looking to build depth in the roster as far as looking forward and acquiring as many picks and young talent as we can. You mentioned the first half of the draft, especially the first 3 to 4 picks are expected to be day one contributors to help us win a championship. That's just how it is this season. And I think you're right. I think that although we identified those positions of need, certainly if they see a running back, you mentioned a running back, or even an interior defensive lineman that's in the first round that they have graded way higher than every other position of need that's left. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them grab a guy that they feel like can help them win now.
For sure. And I have to say, there have been some times in my younger years when I would get upset because I felt like we drafted a position and there was some redundancy there, right? Like we take a guy and we're like, we're already loaded there, right? Like what do we need this guy for? And then boom, an injury happens or a trade happens or a veteran guy just starts to fall off. So, these guys have a little bit more insight than us. So it's also important to trust the process, trust our front office and their history. Because, based on our record, like the chances of this guy coming in and contributing are pretty good in comparison to some other teams. But, things are definitely going to be different with Eric DeCosta, as we saw last year in comparison to Ozzie Newsome. Glenn, I want to ask you a question here is, Eric has been really aggressive and, Garrett talked about this in our last video that he asked him about trading up or back, and he was kind of ambiguous, right? Like he left the door open on purpose. So based on the fact that we're in win now mode, like you mentioned, and Eric DeCosta is running the ship, how do you think that this strategy of his is going to differ from Ozzie Newsome, who is a great drafter himself?
Hall of Famer.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you think that his strategy is going to, be different from what we're accustomed to with Ozzie Newsome?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question. That's kind of the most interesting part of not just this season, but going forward, drafts in general, because we've only seen one guy doing it for such a long time. Now, those two guys with Eric and Ozzie, they've been working together during this whole process, and it almost seems like maybe they kind of just switched roles with this change, with Eric becoming the trigger guy, but Ozzie's still very much involved on the strategy and scouting of all these players. So it's going to be interesting, because you mentioned that sometimes you'd see us take a player and you think that that's already a position where they're pretty strong in. And I remember Ozzie saying in years past that cornerback is one position in general. There was two positions, I believe it was corner and pass rush, where you can't have enough of them. And certainly corner seemed like a position that he liked to grab a few of them. Now, and I think what could change is I think Eric could have that same mentality, but for the other side of the ball and for wide receivers. Because we heard him mention last year that he just didn't feel like we were taking enough swings at wide receiver. When asked a question about our poor track record in drafting and developing top quality wide receivers, he said we just weren't taking enough swings. So I fully expect him to to take a few swings, certainly a wide receiver. When you look at this draft being a depth, having a depth at wide receiver, I would not be surprised if we see just kind of like we did last year when we saw multiple picks go towards tight end, kind of surprised a lot of people after they took Hayden in the first or 2 years ago, to then take Andrews in the third. I think we could see that with wide receiver. I would not be surprised at all if we see a wide out in the first and third, maybe second and third. I would not be surprised at all because look at our wide receiving core. Outside of Marquise Brown, who do we have that you're like, wow, that guy's really, really something good? I mean, anyone?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, when you have to turn around and think about Willie Snead, no offense to Willie Snead, he's a great utility guy.
Yeah.
But
he doesn't scare defenses at all.
Right. And I wish he wouldn't have cut his hair, man. I'm afraid he lost his power.
Yeah, he might have lost some mojo, although that helmet probably fits a little more comfortably. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, that thing had to have been snug. But then also his willingness, I think, to trade up is going to be much higher than Ozzy's was. Ozzy, and I think they both value draft picks immensely. But Ozzy, man, I tell you what, if you had to put a percent, what would you say his likelihood to move back as opposed to move forward?
Yeah, you're talking about Ozzy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean 70-30, right? 70, he's moving back. 70% chance he's moving back, 30% chance. And I'm being generous on that.
That's what it felt like at least, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think what we'll end up seeing from Eric, I agree with you. I think we'll move up, but I think that we're going to see both. I think we'll move back and up. I think he's going to play all around the board. I think that he's the best GM at the draft.
Nice.
Hands down. I mean, I think he's just a couple steps ahead. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I wonder if the offensive trend that you're talking about is going to continue. I can see that happening as well. And I tell you what, it would excite a lot of Ravens fans to go after a wide receiver. You know what I mean?
Running back, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's going to be really interesting. But there's a couple other points I want to get to here. And just some tips to help you guys keep your composure while you're watching the draft. Because I'm going to be honest with you. The year that we took Marlon Humphrey, O.J. Howard was on the board. I was sitting at Glenn's house. And when O.J. Howard went off, when we didn't take O.J. Howard, I fell out of my chair. Literally, like, no exaggeration.
Yeah.
And I was still trying to figure out what happened here. Like, sure, Humphrey was a good prospect and he was athletic, and they talked about him, his lack of tracking, but everything else he was really good at. And we reached and whatever. People were blowing Ozzy up on the radio.
Yep.
I think that pick looks pretty good now.
Yeah, all pro. Yeah, I think he ended up being right on that one. I mean, I think O.J. Howard will end up having a pretty good year, especially this year because he just got a heck of a good quarterback to throw him the ball and Tom Brady. But I think clearly Ozzy made the right decision. Certainly with hindsight, with the fact that we ended up getting Andrews and Hurst for a time. Yeah, it ended up being the right pick, but I think you're right. I think it's hard to not get caught up in the names.
Yeah.
Not get caught up in those picks that, the DK Metcalf of last year where everyone was on him because of his measurables, his shirtless photos on Twitter where he had like 1% body fat and, it's just – but honestly, if you look at that, everybody was pointing to him. We ended up with Hollywood, and I think we're pretty happy with who we ended up with there. And both were kind of a flashy pick there because Marquise was getting some pub too. I don't want to act like he wasn't. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that the most important thing is it filling an area where it can help us win this year and not necessarily get caught up in the name. I think you're right. I think you pointed it out well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I wanted to mention is just the idea of staying patient. You talked about Ozzy, probably the most – I think that was his greatest virtue as a GM was his patience. Right?
Sleep on it. He'd say sleep on it.
Yeah, stay patient. Let the other GM's seat get hot. Let that hand get sweaty, with that phone. But don't do it yourself. So the reason I say stay patient is because the Ravens sometimes lack in fireworks in the first round. Like it took us forever to get Hayden Hurst. We traded back, I think, twice.
Yeah.
But what happened is I know a lot of people after we took Hayden Hurst turned the TV off.
I do a lot. My brother in one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people we can put you to sleep in the first round, but we can also create some fireworks because if you're anybody who doesn't remember this, ought to remember now that in that same draft, of course, we traded back into the last pick of the first round, and we took the unanimous MVP of the NFL last year, Lamar Jackson. So stay patient. Watch it all the way through because Eric and the Ravens front office never out.
Never out, and that fifth-year option, if it's a player that they really covet, like Lamar, that fifth-year option is big time to keep him, and you only get that fifth-year option if they're a first-round pick. And you're right. I mean, I remember calling my brother going, "Did you see it?" And he's, "No, I turned it off." I said, "We just got Lamar, man." Like I had to fill him in on the news. So, yeah, be patient. Make sure you're watching. Even after they pick at 28, don't turn it off. Don't especially. It's a good thing to do is Twitter can kind of give you a good little note. Like they haven't left the draft room yet. Usually, if they don't have their press conference scheduled. And they're still in the war room, then yeah, you're most likely going to see some fireworks. But I want to know how different it's kind of weird this year because they're talking about what they're going to do, how many people they're going to allow in the draft room, how much of this is going to be remote from home. So it's going to be interesting to see how many are actually in the room. The decision makers. I mean, I assume we're going to have Eric, Ozzie, John, and probably Joe Ortiz. But who else? I mean, maybe the offensive and defensive coordinators. I don't know who. It's just so unique this year on how they're gonna form. Make this happen.
Yeah, and the other thing too. What after we get a good pick, we're not gonna be high fiving, no hugs, no
virtual chest bump
claps or something like what?
Well, yeah, it's gonna be tough. I'll tell you what. My brother's my next door neighbor, so he'll be over. I'll have one person to high five. But, yeah, we're not going to see them walk across the stage and give the commissioner a big bear hug. And Yeah,
I think it'll be weird when they show that shot of that empty room, like you're saying. I mean, it's 4 or 5 guys. We make that pick, and then they're like, yeah, they give themselves an air five. It's going to be weird. But the last thing I wanted to keep in mind, and we kind of touched on this, but just to kind of reiterate, is that I've had this happen as well where if we have a position in need, use your position inside linebacker, right? And early in the draft or, in the first half of the draft, we go with a guy that you don't particularly like. That doesn't mean that the Ravens are done at that position. Like you said, we did the same thing with tight end, and we've done that multiple times at tight end. We did that with Dennis Pitta and Ed Dixon? Ed Dixon,
yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And obviously Dennis ended up being the better prospect and was picked later in the draft.
Yeah, same way.
So far, it's turned out to be the same with Hayden Hurst and with Mark Andrews.
Yep.
So just because we take a guy early that might not be your guy, if your guy is still on the board, keep your eyes out. Stay patient once again because we could take 2 inside linebackers. I can totally see that.
Yeah.
Because we could, take 2 guys that are different. Our draft experts talked about guys that were good in between the tight ends and other guys that were good in coverage. Maybe we take one that's good at each. We don't know how it's going to work out, but stay patient as far as, if you have had a guy identified that we're going to take. But I'm really excited about the draft. We hope this helps you guys put some things in perspective as far as the draft goes. And make sure you stay tuned because we're going to do a couple things. One, we're going to have our full 7-round mock.
Yep.
And then we're also going to have a couple more position breakdowns with hands picked on. And then the other thing we're going to do that Glenn and I have been talking about is we're going to do our immediate impact or our immediate reaction, right after the picks during the draft. So we'll get on and let you guys know what our opinion is, what our take is, how excited we are or disappointed we are in the pick. So make sure whatever you guys do, stay tuned, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you hit the notifications bell so that way you know when these videos are coming out and you guys can stay up to date as far as all things Ravens go. And we will see you guys soon.
See you.